The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone, on this beautiful fall-like Thursday. It's Francesca Federico at 12 Points, and I'm excited to partner with one of our favorite employment law firms in Boston, Hirsch Roberts Weinstein, for this very important webinar topic on what employers need to know about the COVID-19 vaccination policies and getting their employees back to work. I have a very special attorney over there on the phone with me today, Mark Mackey, who's an associate, and he has a extensive knowledge in this topic and in working with employers in and around Massachusetts. So I'm going to hand it over to him and let him introduce himself as well.
Thanks, Francesca. Really appreciate you and 12 Points inviting me here to discuss this, hugely important topic. And we have a packed agenda today. So, here we have four main topics that we want to cover in the presentation. First, President Biden's COVID-19 vaccine mandate announcement and what that might mean for employers. Second, in connection with that announcement, we're going to cover mandatory vaccine policies, including some of the legal issues to keep an eye out for. And then third, we'll go through requests for accommodations for mandatory vaccination policies. And finally, we will round out the presentation by briefly talking about what leaves might be available if an employee contracts COVID-19. So with that, let's go to the next slide.
The legalese, that's extremely important.
The legalese, that's important. So again, just to note that this webinar, not legal advice. You should always contact your employment counsel if you have questions about anything that's going to be talked about today, COVID policies in general when it comes to employment. And also keep in mind that especially with COVID-19 and, the guidance that's coming out, it's always changing. So, what's true today on this webinar is true today on this webinar. A month or two from now, the guidance might be a little different. So again, be in constant contact with your employment counsel if you have questions. So first, let's talk about President Biden's September 9th announcement, which included widespread mandates with respect to the COVID-19 vaccine in the workplace. And as you can see on this slide, President Biden's COVID-19 action plan included several orders and directives related to the COVID-19 vaccine. Among these orders included an order requiring all federal agencies to implement a program requiring all of their federal employees to receive the COVID-19 vaccine, as well as an order requiring certain federal contractors and subcontractors to mandate that their employees be vaccinated. In each instance, the vaccine mandate is subject to exceptions as required by law, meaning where employees may be unable to receive the vaccination because of a medical condition or sincerely held religious belief, which we'll discuss later in the presentation, they may be exempt from, this requirement. And then with respect to the contractor mandate specifically, there are certain threshold qualifications included in that mandate that address which contractors are covered. And that issue is a little more in depth than what we have time to cover here today. But if you have federal contracts and have questions about coverage, you should feel free to reach out to me or your preferred employment counsel and just make sure and ask about coverage. And then probably the most talked about and widespread announcement Biden to OSHA to develop and issue an emergency temporary standard requiring that all private sector employers with 100 or more employees require proof of vaccination or routine weekly testing. So let's talk about that a little bit. If we can go to the next slide. All right, so this emergency temporary standard is what it's called. That's included in President Biden's announcement. It's yet to be published, so we don't know exactly what is going to be required, except to to the extent that it was actually mentioned in the announcement. What we do know is that the ETS, Emergency Temporary Standard, will supplement, a different ETS, which was adopted with respect to healthcare workers on June 21st, 2021. We also know that the mandate will require, as I mentioned before, that all private sector employers with 100 or more employees will be required to provide proof of vaccination or a negative weekly test result. And it also requires employers to provide paid time off for workers to receive and recover from the COVID-19 vaccine. So the exact mechanics of how this will work is expected to be included in the standard to be published in the coming weeks. For now, employers with 100 or more employees, they may want to consider taking steps in preparation for when this standard actually does come out, including starting the process of developing their own policy around vaccination requirements. If we go to the next slide. And to that end, next we're going to talk about mandatory vaccination policies. So while the OSHA standards will apply only to those employers with 100 or more employees, vaccination policies are on the minds of employers of all sizes. So, first, as we can see on this slide, first let's talk about mandatory versus voluntary vaccination policies and some matters to consider in deciding on which type of policy to implement. As you may have read about, there has been some litigation throughout the country regarding employer vaccination mandates. I'm going to talk a little bit later in the presentation about religious and medical accommodations, which is an area where we see litigation a lot, but particularly in the vaccination context, it seems to be on the rise. But as far as facial challenges to mandatory vaccination policies, we've almost routinely seen courts throughout the country dismiss such challenges and find that in general, mandatory vaccination policies are legal. And this is consistent with, over a century of case law allowing for the implementation of mandatory vaccination policies. Essentially, courts have been saying that, a mandatory vaccination policy doesn't coerce an employee to get vaccinated, it doesn't force them to get vaccinated against their will, but rather, it presents a choice for employees. It allows them the choice between getting vaccinated or finding work elsewhere. So, as far as legal challenges go, there has been solid precedent established allowing for vaccine mandates in the workplace, generally. Then with respect to practical considerations, one thing that we have heard employers talk a lot about, and you may have seen in the news, is the real and even potential likelihood that some employees would rather leave their employment than get vaccinated. For employers thinking about issuing a mandatory vaccination policy who are not otherwise legally required to do so, this is one of those practical considerations, one of those areas that you really should be considering and be prepared for when deciding to implement a policy. Because it's going to be important that if you do implement a policy, that you administer it, consistently across the board. Which means that if you're a policy, yes.
Do you mind if I just stop you there? We have a question from one of our participants. Do you have any insight on whether subsidiaries with fewer than 100 employees of companies that have over 100 employees will be covered?
If it's a subsidiary and it's a separate legal entity, we don't, first off, let me say, we don't have any guidance on that. So there's not any, strict, anything specifically to point to from OSHA. But I would imagine that, and, again, don't take this as word of law, I'm just, assuming. I would imagine that a subsidiary that's a completely separate legal entity may be treated as that, a separate legal entity. But there's also joint employer issues to consider. I remember when the Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which I'll touch on briefly later, first came out, the guidance in implementing that act, because there was a number of employee threshold, did specifically address subsidiaries and joint employers. So I think I'd imagine that it'll be addressed in the guidance, but as of right now, we don't know for a fact.
Okay, thank you.
All right. So, like I was saying, it's important to administer a COVID policy consistently, which means that if your policy applies to salespersons and your top salesperson is refusing to get the vaccine for an unprotected reason, you should be prepared to terminate them just as you would any other employee violating the policy, or take whatever appropriate action that you would take against any other employee that's violating the policy. Further, employers may also consider alternatives to a mandatory vaccination policy where legally acceptable. So such alternatives may include a policy under which employees who are not vaccinated either work from home, have to present a negative test result periodically, or wear a mask at all times while at work. So with this type of policy, you don't have the same issues with, potentially losing employees who don't want to get vaccinated because it's, a voluntary policy. But on the flip side, there may be concerns from other employees who feel strongly about vaccines and that everybody should be vaccinated, that they feel less safe in the workplace knowing that not everybody is vaccinated. So that's kind of the balance that you have to consider when you're implementing a voluntary policy. It's also important to remember that, except in those industries where the government has mandated vaccines, the decision on whether to implement a mandatory or voluntary vaccination policy is ultimately up to the employer. In coming to that decision, you're going to want to consider the topics we already discussed, as well as, company culture and the mission of the company, employee sentiment, whether you're in a customer-facing industry, and, especially the health and safety of those who you work with and who you employ. Now, once you've decided that you want to enforce a mandatory vaccination policy, you'll next have to consider the best approach to implementation. So one logistical decision to be made is how employees will be expected to provide proof of vaccination. Will employees be asked to show a physical copy of their vaccination card? Will they, have to email a picture of their card to HR? Who's going to be checking for proof of vaccination and keeping track of that? What we see a lot of is that employers will have the employees send a picture of the vaccination card to a member of the HR team, and that team member would then keep this proof in the employee's confidential medical file, which is going to be another question on implementation. Has to do with timeline. So employers should consider when they want employees to be fully vaccinated by, and then provide a reasonable amount of time, for allowing for compliance. So keep in mind that the Moderna vaccine, for example, requires 2 doses, with the second dose 28 days apart from the first. So it wouldn't be reasonable to roll out a policy that requires employees to be fully vaccinated by the following week or face termination, right? You got to give them the time to actually comply with the policy. So you may consider announcing a COVID-19 mandatory vaccination policy 6 weeks to 2 months in advance of the date on which employees are required to show proof of the vaccine. And of course, if you plan to have a mandatory COVID-19 policy, you're going to need to actually implement a policy. So let's talk about what goes into a written mandatory policy. We go to the next slide, please. All right, so one topic to address is who the policy applies to. So is it going to apply to all employees, or is it just going to apply to employees in certain roles? We've seen distinctions made between, client or customer facing roles versus the back of the office type roles that may not require as much face-to-face interaction. So first off, you're going to want to decide who's the policy going to apply. Next, you're going to want to know what is required under the policy. And this goes along the lines with what we discussed about implementation. What are you actually asking the employee to do? This includes by what date or what specific event employees will be required to be vaccinated. Also, for most, I would imagine that you're asking the employee to send a picture of their completed vaccination card to a particular person within the company. So we're going to want to make sure to include this information on who that information should be sent to. We're going to want to include that right in the policy so it's clear to the employee about what's expected of them. There should also be a provision in the policy that states that employees who are unable to receive the vaccine due to a religious or medical reason may seek a reasonable accommodation. And we'll talk about reasonable accommodations and those kind of requests in just a moment. And then another area to address is consequences for failure to comply with the policy. So here we want to be crystal clear. If an employee who fails to be vaccinated by a set date or event will be terminated, we want to be explicit in the policy of that fact. We don't want there to be any confusion or questions from the employee whether or not they knew of the consequences. an option to include in this type of policy is language that says, if employee does not receive the vaccination or isn't fully vaccinated by X date, then they will be subject to discipline up to and including termination. This leaves a little wiggle room. So if the person doesn't receive the vaccine by the date set, you can then, maybe suspend the employee for a certain time period and say, you're suspended pending your, receipt of the vaccine by Y date. And if you don't receive the vaccine by that date, then you will be terminated. This kind of gives a second chance, second bite of the apple, and kind of gives a little more flexibility to the employer in deciding on how to implement their policy.
Mark,
so if we go to the,
we have a question
please.
here. We have a question from as well. Do you have any suggestions on how to implement a mandatory vax policy when the building management doesn't mandate employees or visitors to the building or within our office?
I just for clarification on the question, is it you're not requiring people to come into the office?
It seems that
It
seems like they're asking the building that they are in, their management doesn't mandate their employees or any visitors to have the vaccine, but they want to implement it, a policy for their company within this building.
Understood. Okay. Yeah. So I mean, that's what's required by the building versus the employer. It's it's kind of up to the employer at the end of the day, right? If people are coming into your office, you can require the employees, any vendors, any visitors who are coming in to be vaccinated, right? Subject to what we talked about, or what we will talk about with reasonable accommodations. So as far as implementation goes, I would say that you would want to implement, that type of policy, a mandatory vaccination policy for anybody who enters the office. If they're in the building but not in the office, they're probably just going to have to follow the building rules. But you could even, for your employees at least, I'd say that you can say, once you enter the building, we're expecting you to, wear a mask or be vaccinated if you're going to enter the building. That is your control over your employment contingency, as opposed to what the building gets to say about what your employees can and can't do. What we've seen a lot more of is actually the flip side, where the employer doesn't want to enforce a policy, but the building does, and that gets a little more tricky, where you're probably dealing more on a business sense with the landlord of the building, saying, this is how we're trying to do things, and trying to negotiate with the landlord about what's going to be allowed and what's not. But as far as, if you have a policy, if you're requiring your employees to be vaccinated before they enter the building or before they enter the office, as far as I'd be concerned, that's the policy, and that's what they have to follow, regardless of what the building actually says. And as far as for vendors go, you'd probably want to let all your vendors know that that's your policy, and maybe put some postings up at the start of your office to indicate what the policy actually is and what they're expected to follow. So moving on to exemption requests. So you've heard me mention a few times about requests for accommodations from mandatory policies and exemption requests. As you can see on this slide, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has published a set of frequently asked questions addressing how COVID-19 vaccinations interact with federal anti-discrimination laws. And I'd encourage everybody who's considering implementing a policy or has any questions about COVID's interaction with those laws to visit this website. It's right there. You can search that term, what you should know about COVID-19, and just search EEOC, and you'll see a full set of frequently asked questions. But for our purposes, if we go to the next slide, so for our purposes, FAQ K1 addresses mandatory vaccination policies and the federal anti-discrimination laws. And that provides in part that in some circumstances, Title VII and the ADA require an employer to provide reasonable accommodations for employees who, because of a disability or sincerely held religious belief, practice, or observance, do not get vaccinated for COVID-19 unless providing an accommodation will pose undue hardship on the operation of the employer's business. So just like any other workplace policy, employers implementing a mandatory vaccination policy must offer a reasonable accommodation, provided it doesn't cause an undue hardship, for individuals who cannot receive the vaccine for medical reasons or because of a sincerely held religious belief. And let's talk about what that means a little bit. If we can go to the next slide. So when we're looking at reasonable accommodations from vaccine mandates, we're likely looking at requests to be exempt from a mandate. A reasonable accommodation request may be based on medical, religious, or pregnancy-related reasons. And one thing to be aware of here is that requests that don't fall into one of these categories are likely not protected, meaning that political or philosophical objections to receive the vaccine, which we've heard of a lot, and you see it a lot in the media. Those types of objections aren't protected and therefore don't need to be accommodated. With respect to the protected exemptions, so for a medical exemption request, when you do get a request for an accommodation to the vaccine policy based on a medical request, you may ask the employee to provide a doctor's note or other documentation identifying why they can't receive the vaccine. Similarly, for pregnancy-related requests, you may ask for the same. And often, we kind of lump pregnancy and medical requests into the same category for this in this context when it's having to do with an exemption from a vaccine policy. But on this slide, we have them separated in light of the Massachusetts Pregnant Workers Fairness Act, which provides specific requirements about accommodating pregnancy-related conditions. And I've seen this come up recently in the context of nursing, and an employee who recently had a baby, and they're nursing that baby and requesting an exemption request from the vaccine mandate from their employer. So in those situations, same thing goes, right? You're gonna look for some sort of medical documentation suggesting why they shouldn't have to be vaccinated, and then may or may not grant the request based off what the medical documentation says. What we've been seeing a lot of really, if we can go back to the last slide real quick, what we've really been seeing a lot of is the religious accommodation requests. And these are trickier because traditionally and consistent with EEOC guidance, employers should not be putting much of a challenge to what an employee says is their sincerely held religious belief. That said, there are a number of websites out there now that are providing language for employees to use to just claim a sincerely held religious belief, even when they really don't have that sincerely held belief, just so that they can get out of the vaccine mandate. So recently, we've been seeing a lot more pushback from employers, including asking follow-up questions about the religious belief that they're claiming, that the employee is claiming doesn't allow them to get vaccinated. So in these situations, you may want to consider having employees explain on a form rather than in a one-on-one conversation what their religious belief is and why that it prevents them from getting vaccinated. That way we have documentation of what was asked and exactly what the employee explained as their sincerely held religious belief and what how it prevents them from getting the vaccine. And particularly in the religious context, these are somewhat complicated issues. So if you get a religious accommodation request and you're questioning whether or not to grant it, I'd encourage you to contact your employment counsel to discuss that before making a decision. And if we go to the next slide, and we're going to roll right into the last one, seeing how much time we have left. I want to just make sure we get to everything. So this last topic that we're going to cover is COVID-19 related leaves. If we go to the next slide and just hit it one more time, Francesca. Great. And so we're going to go through this by going through a hypothetical. So an employee has tested positive for COVID-19 and must remain out of the workplace. The employee has asked about their options to continue being paid while out of the workplace and has also asked about when they may return to work. So if we can go to the next slide. So what we're talking about here is paid leave options for when an employee is out of work after testing positive for COVID-19. So Massachusetts employees are entitled to up to 40 hours of protected leave under the Massachusetts COVID-19 temporary emergency paid sick leave law, which was originally set to expire September 30th, but it's recently been extended through April 1st of next year. And considering the hypothetical posed, under the law, the employee who tested positive for COVID-19 would be entitled for the 40 hours of protected leave. And then also they must be paid, compensated during that leave up to a maximum of $850. And Massachusetts employers may seek a reimbursement for this compensation up to that $850 amount. And for information about the leave and the reimbursement process, if you just Google MA COVID sick leave law, one of the first options that come up bring you right to the state website. I have the Families First Coronavirus Response Act leave up there. That recently expired as of September 30th, 2021. I left it up there just so you know that it did expire in case employees are asking about leave under that federal law. And then other paid options that may be available to the employee include their own paid time off or their own earned sick time. They may be able to apply for leave under the Massachusetts Paid Family Leave Law, though that they would be applying through the state, and it's up to the state to decide whether or not to grant that leave. And then you also may offer, if the employee's able to do so, such as if they're asymptomatic, you may offer to allow them to continue working from home during the time that they're in isolation. You wouldn't want to force this option on an employee, but if it's something that they could work from home and they fail up to it, you may offer it as an option while they're out on leave. Employers should also keep in mind that they may have other obligations or options related to unpaid leave under the FMLA or the Americans with Disabilities Act as well. So recognizing the time that we only have 3 minutes, I'm just going to note that what is left up here on this slide, the return to work, that's the CDC guidance for ending isolation after a positive COVID-19 test. So the requirements are up there. If you have any questions about those, reach out to me or your employment counsel. And with that, we can open it up for any questions that we might have in the chat, Francesca, or anything that might come up in these last couple minutes.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So we do have one. It says, and I believe I answered this, but will the webinar be available to watch later as well? So we've recorded this and we're going to send this out. And if you do want the slides as well, we can always ask Mark and HRW if they can send those to us and we can send those out as well. I don't see any more questions. So Mark, I really want to thank you. 12 Points loves to find partners like a firm like HRW in the Boston area. So if you ever have any questions for all of our 401k clients on this call, feel free to come to us and we can lean on our partners over at HRW for their expertise. So thank you all so much. Mark, thank you. And we look forward to hearing from anyone.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to 12 Point. Thanks, everyone.